Family and fellow soldiers, I'm the Professor, and this is the Moment of Truth. By now, I'm sure that a lot of you have heard about the Supreme Court's recent ruling regarding Texas' deportation law. We're going to get to that in a minute, but there's also some other news in the world of illegal immigration that I want to talk about. I'm sure that some of you have also seen that Chicago, of all places, has been, at least as the headlines from the white media have been saying, they've been evicting migrants from shelters. Now, it's not until you actually read the article that you see that, as usual, they bury in the story that actually there's been fewer than 10 migrants who have been evicted from Chicago's shelters. So that's kind of a far cry from the idea that apparently they're kicking all of these people out. They're not doing that at all. This is basically a gesture. You got the mayor of the city, this Brandon Johnson character, who I'm firmly convinced must be related to Jason Johnson somehow. And this guy, I guess, is doing this because, well, he's got to do something. But the question happens to be, is this going to be all that's actually done? Or is this perhaps the beginning of what could be a larger trend? Hard to say. But one thing that's not in doubt, though, is that apparently the immigrants, the handful of them who were told that they had to leave the shelters, they didn't like what was happening. One of them, who's from Venezuela, actually said that he felt that being forced out was disrespectful. Apparently, he felt that it didn't show him any respect. Quote, "It was clear that I needed to leave and I respected that, but the treatment, it was a lack of respect." He was quite indignant, apparently. And not to be messy, but while this guy said that he felt disrespected by being forced to leave the place he had called home, a shelter he had been living in, I have to wonder, when he left Venezuela, did that also make him feel disrespected? I would think that it should have, because Venezuela is actually the place where the man was born, place where he grew up. He had spent all of his life there, but he didn't fight for home. Instead, he ran away from it. And that's an issue in and of itself. Situations don't get better because people run from them. They only get better when you stop, turn, and actually confront the problem. Now, one of the things that disgusted me but didn't surprise me is that in Chicago, you've had the authorities going on this jihad of closing down as many schools as possible, but most of them in black areas. They've been doing everything that they can to close down black schools in black areas. They were all victims of budget cuts, at least that's what the authorities were saying, shutting down all of these schools left, right, and center. They just didn't have the money to keep them open. No staff and personnel. Can't do nothing about it. Well, it turns out that one elementary school, Wadsworth Elementary School in particular, has been used as a shelter for these migrants, for a lot of them anyway. And that being the case, apparently the city was able to come up with money for schools. They just couldn't do it to actually educate people, especially not black students. But if you have people who are not even citizens of the country, well, they'll go ahead and find the money for that. They'll pony that up immediately. This is the reason why whenever it comes time to talk about certain issues, like the redlining lawsuits that the Justice Department brought against a number of banks, or when it came to the Supreme Court ruling regarding the Minority Business Development Agency, I thought it was important to point out how the money gets spent in these cases. Because in the case of the so-called Minority Business Development Agency, an agency that was created allegedly to actually address the rampant, deliberate, targeted deprivation of funds that black people face whenever it comes time to try to get loans for a business or money to help grow a business, we get completely singled out to be deprived of those funds. So was the federal government, at least allegedly, trying to do something about it on its own? And yet black people are the main ones who don't get any money from that either. They make it a point to prioritize non-black people, especially if they happen to be immigrants. They'll go ahead and make sure that that's what it becomes. As I stated in the video, it's been documented that at least in 2022, 8 times as much money went from the Minority Business Development Agency to Hispanic applicants as opposed to black applicants. So if you have two groups whose numbers are, at least on paper, equal, how do you get a disparity like that? It's because you have an entire agency. This is not a mistake on their part. This is the agency working exactly the way that it was intended. And the same thing happens to go for the Justice Department's lawsuits against those redlining banks. It was black people who they were actually discriminating against. But the Justice Department made it a point to tell these banks, well, you have to also make sure that you send money to Hispanic applicants as well. We want to make sure that they get included with this. Oh, and also, you need to make it an effort on your part that you're going to be reaching out to people specifically who do not speak English. Make sure that you hire people, and they told them, make sure you hire Spanish-speaking people. This is going out of their way to make sure this is going to be for people who just showed up. And I'm sure that the folks in Chicago, a number of them who happen to be getting evicted from these shelters, I'm sure they'll be glad to know that the federal government is doing everything it can to make certain that they get money either from the Minority Business Development Agency or from these banks to make sure that, hey, you may not have an economic floor, but that's okay. The U.S. government is going to invent one. And don't let anybody tell you that this is about race. It's not. The white right is always inventing straw men, always inventing phony outrages, and one of them in particular is white replacement theory. And that being the case, it's a theory that has no basis in fact. The people who are coming across the southern border, who the white right are saying are going to replace white people, these individuals identify as white on their driver's licenses, on the census forms, job applications, college applications. So where's the white replacement at? It's not there at all. That being the case, this is not a racial issue. And of course, you also have a large number of people from Asia who have also either been smuggled into the country or have slipped across the southern border or what have you. And that being the case, none of them can claim that this is racial. Because you have individuals among those groups who will be the first ones to say, why, we pull ourselves up by our bootstraps, racism is not a problem like these black folks keep saying. Well, that being the case, then that also goes for this. Nobody gets to turn around now and say, oh my God, look at all the racism we're being targeted. No, this is a matter of laws were broken. This is a cultural problem. This is a law enforcement problem. It's a legal problem, but it's not a racial one. And as black people, I think that we should weigh in on this. Immigration happens to affect everyone. And by the way, for the people who keep saying that we need poor people to work on certain jobs and such, that's a problem in and of itself. What are you going to do when you run out of poor people to help artificially lower the prices of certain goods or services? What happens when you run out of those poor people? You can expect the third world to be a labor force forever? That's not realistic. But apparently, especially for good white liberals, they think that it sounds virtuous to say that. So basically what they're saying is it's a moral position that the country, the United States, should always count on having poor people to do the kind of jobs that white leftists think are important, but apparently not important enough for them to either do themselves or to actually pay an adequate wage that would attract people to it. Well, black people are not at all enthused about any of this. And that's the reason why whenever people come around talking about the black, brown, black, yellow alliances and such, black people have said, you know what, this is not going to work. We've been dancing by ourselves and our feet have gotten very tired. So that being the case, everybody's going to have to stand on their own and they'll have to stand based on the positions that they've taken. See, we're going into an election cycle. And in places, especially like New York and Chicago, you've had black residents who have made it very clear that the massive influxes of migrants have had a deleterious effect on the black community and has been for a few generations now. So that's why you got the mayor of Chicago who has decided that he's going to be doing this. We're going to have a handful of illegals who are going to be told that they got to leave the shelters. Okay, and then what? What's going to be the next step? The next step? Go and vote for Joe Biden. See, we're addressing your concerns. You know, if somebody actually wants to convince the black community that something's being done about illegal immigration, you're going to have to do a heck of a lot better than just a handful of people who are moved out of one shelter in the Windy City. This political theater is not going to fool anyone. And speaking of fools, in related news, everything's bigger in Texas, including the stupidity. Governor Abbott is proof of that. Well, apparently they've been successful at the Supreme Court, which everybody knew that they would be. The far right-leaning Supreme Court would rubber stamp whatever it is that these right-wing nuts want to do. In this case, Texas passed a statewide law saying basically the cops can go ahead and throw people out of the state themselves. They can basically do the job that ordinarily would be passed on to the feds. And truth be told, it's hard to see how they don't have anything to stand on. If you said no to it, well, what would you say if somebody happens to be in the country illegally? We can't do anything at all? We can't even arrest you? No, they say that people can be arrested even if it's not the feds who do it. But what they were talking about is they don't want any sort of mass policy taking place at the state level. Well, putting aside the asinine behavior of Greg Abbott and moron DeSantis and the rest of these right-wing nuts who are trying to use illegal immigration, at least pretending as if they want to actually do something about it. If you haven't heard my particular spiel on this, here's the Reader's Digest version. You cannot truthfully say that you want to actually do something about illegal immigration unless you do something about the economic factors that have been supplied to make it where it's attractive for illegal aliens to come into the U.S. in the first place. I'm talking specifically about the employers who break the law to employ them, landlords who break the law to give them shelter, banks who lobbied hard to make sure that they could actually charge their little wire transfer fees for people to send money back home, so-called remittances. that kind of thing. Unless you're going to be dealing with the individuals who make money off of illegal immigration, you cannot truthfully say that you want to tackle it. And at no point have the Republicans ever said, we're going to criminalize all of these businesses. We're going to go after them. We're going to make sure that they get the hardest time there is. See, while moron DeSantis and others are trying to pass laws to criminalize talking about slavery in schools, they pretend as if we're going to send some illegals to New York or Chicago. That'll show those liberals. And of course, their base, who always get a sugar rush out of anything that they think is insulting the black community, it goes right over their empty heads. They don't see the scam, but then again, the people who are the most blind are the ones who are simply too dumb to open their eyes. So while I do think it's interesting that Abbott's little bit of political theater has gotten thumbs up from the Supreme Court, by the same token, if you're thinking that this is going to be the solution for illegal immigration, it's certainly not a bad thing. It's certainly not a problem. But the truth of the matter happens to be you have not dealt with the actual cause of the problem. You've only dealt with the symptoms. As long as the states refuse to punish and penalize unscrupulous employers, lawless landlords, and these criminal banksters, as long as they don't do anything about those individuals who have been the main ones supplying the economic infrastructure that has fueled and encouraged all of this mass migration, unless you deal with that, you're not actually going to be solving the problem, not in any meaningful way. It's not enough to simply have guys with guns running around. See, this is all about protecting the almost entirely white business class who happen to make their money off of illegal immigration. It's about protecting them. You want to pacify the people by saying, see, we're doing some mass roundups. Well, what are you doing to punish the individuals who enticed and invited this wave of migrants in the first place? What's being done about them? Nothing. They've got genetic immunity from law. So what we're seeing is that on both sides of the political aisle, illegal immigration is being used as a political football in their game of power politics. Both of them are pretending as if they're doing something, when in reality, they're just performing for the cameras. They're just trying to find a way to win the news cycle. And not surprisingly, when it comes to Texas state immigration law, the Biden administration came out of whatever coma it had been in, and they decided that they needed to go to court in order to weigh in on it. But unlike with the weakening of Miranda protections that the Biden administration went to the Supreme Court and argued that they wanted Miranda protections to be weakened, well, when it came to Texas laws regarding immigration and that they were going to be deporting people, all of a sudden the Biden administration was like, oh, no, we have to actually oppose this. Yeah, so if it's something that they think is going to be injurious to black people, then the Biden administration will go to the mat, go to the Supreme Court and say, you got to do whatever's going to harm them niggers. But when it comes to non-black groups, all of a sudden, the Biden administration, well, they still run to the Supreme Court, but they're running to stick up for them. See how that works? Biden is showing who he thinks his real constituency is. It's not the black people who single-handedly put him in the White House and who also handed the Democrats control of the House and the Senate. He's sitting here bending over backwards, breaking his neck to go all in for people who are not even citizens, people who can't even vote for him. Why is that the case? Because as far as Biden's concerned, these are the people who he's hoping are going to replace these troublesome black voters who are no longer so compliant and obedient. That's the end game that Biden thinks that this is going to serve. And this is the reason why more and more black people, especially young black people, those who are 50 and under, this is the reason why they have been saying, you know what, I think we're going to sit this election out. Because they see exactly what this president's for. They see exactly what he's done. And they got a black media that reminds them of stuff like this. So it doesn't just get allowed to go down the memory hole. But that hasn't stopped certain individuals, especially some of these activists, from getting their noses bent out of joint about it. And you got a lot of people who are saying, hey, we're being targeted. I don't think so. What's happening here is that at least some people may be finding out that no matter what they choose to put on a driver's license application or on a job application or any other sort of form, white supremacy already makes up its mind what people are. Sure, it may pretend to play along with it, at least to a certain point, but when white supremacy gets tired of looking at folks, they say, okay, we're going to get you out of here. And by the way, this also goes for Haitian migrants. You got a number of people, especially how the country has had a meltdown in the last few weeks or so. I mean, the situation there, talk about out of the frying pan and into the fire. In this case, it's out of the frying pan and onto the floor. There are a lot of people who have invoked or repeated the talking point that immigrants happen to be a big financial boost for the country, and that being the case, starting businesses and all the rest of it. In that case, then, I say that's exactly what they should say to Greg Abbott. That's exactly what they should say to moron DeSantis. That's exactly what they would say when they're in court. Their legal status doesn't matter. What matters is that they're good for the economy. At least that's what's claimed. Go ahead and try that one. See if it works. But as for the black community, I don't think that we should be neutral about this at all. We should not merely be standing back. And by the way, this doesn't mean to vote Republican or support the GOP. It doesn't. Though what it does mean is that everybody sees whenever black people take a particular position on the issue, it is understood that is the moral position. And this issue is certainly no different. There are a lot of people who apparently think that it's perfectly okay to shake hands with the evil empire. That is, until the evil empire decides to slap you with that same hand. But we also shouldn't valorize or otherwise try to find a way to put a pretty face on failure. If you have a country where the economic situation is in the toilet, it is the responsibility and duty of those citizens to fix it. Because when you look at what's going on right now with a lot of this mass migration, what you're seeing is the direct effect of what happens when situations are in poor shape, but people don't take responsibility for it. What happens is you get roving bands of gangs in Haiti. You get out of control gangs in El Salvador until you had that president down there who decided to build the world's largest prison. And he decided, well, if I go ahead and just arrest everybody, I'll certainly get them. And he did. Sure, his measures were draconian, but they worked. But if you happen to have a situation where the political leadership has thoroughly and completely abandoned the people, you don't run from it. If it's home, you stand and you fight for your home. And if my saying that happens to offend someone, then my question would be, why are you not even more offended about not standing and fighting for home, not standing and fighting for what's yours? When do people stop running from problems and finally face them? Well, apparently not on their own. So that being the case, I have no problem letting events play out, but I would say let's also make sure we understand we don't have any friends here. What we're doing is putting pressure on the situation by not allowing people to use us as some sort of moral foil that they can hide behind and say, see, the Negroes, we're all in this together. No. You're in this by yourself. If white supremacy is coming for you, make sure you show them the driver's license. You know, the one that you put on there that you're white. And then after that, be sure to show the job application where you marked white on that one as well. And the reason why is white supremacy is not blind. It can see this stuff. And if somebody thinks that merely marking something on a driver's license changes anything, you might want to ask Tiger Woods, how did that work out for him? Good day, and be one. I'd like to take a moment to mention some of our contributors. Jerome Simmons, Ikegas Dorset, Kenneth Johnson, Pamela Guidry, and Eve. Salute to them and thank you to everyone for listening, liking, and sharing this message. Black empowerment only exists because of you.